Hello and most welcome to, yes, we have now 1200. Hooray! It's fantastic. It is nothing short of incredible. 1200 episodes. How is that even possible? It's beyond amazing. 1200, maybe 1200 hours of playtime, preparations, I don't know, maybe 10 times as much, 12,000 hours during the last 2.5–3 years. It is indeed something, and how many subjects, and many of them incredibly difficult, and it's all thanks to you, your patience, listening to the endless readouts, well, at last the last 100 episodes. But I bring a promise here, for the future it will be more lively. I may try out at doing it offhand without preparations to see if I can get some more spontaneity into the presentations. And I think that soon will be possible. It's also a matter of how long the voice is able to be stable. I've encountered some difficulties the last weeks here, thanks to a very persistent cold. I'm very happy that that virus that had that cold wasn't the COVID virus, or the strength were given to the COVID virus. Then we would have been in great problem. I will continue today with a Louder Than Words, a just fantastic book about the novel development within science of cognition, neurology, and also science of language, if you like, or how language is perceived. And as I said last time, it got a really good remark even by the great George Lakoff. So it was under the page, let's unpack this idea. And we were talking about mentalese, and it seemed that mentalese had to exit. No longer be part of the curriculum, so to speak. And I'm just going to repeat, it was 3 groups that converge on the same thought. And this is in itself very interesting, because actually often this is the case. All of a sudden it seems that the time is ripe, and it just happens. Three different groups. One was the cognitive psychologist Larry Barsalou and his students at Emory University in Georgia. The second was a group of neuroscientists in Parma, Italy. And the third was a group of cognitive scientists at the International Computer Science Institute in Berkeley, where I happen to be working as a graduate student. There was clearly something in the water at Zeitgeist. The idea was the embodied simulation hypothesis, a proposal that would make the idea of embodiment concrete enough to compete with mentalese. Put simply, maybe we understand language by simulating in our minds what it would be like to experience the things that language describes. Let's unpack this idea a little bit. what it means to simulate something in your mind. We actually simulate all the time. You do it when you imagine your parents' faces, or fixate in your mind's eye on the misplayed poker hand. You're simulated when you imagine sounds in your head without any sound waves hitting your ears, whether it's the bass line of the White Stripes' Seven Nation Army or the sound of screeching tires. And you can probably conjure simulations of what strawberries taste like when covered with whipped cream, or what fresh lavender smells like. You can also simulate actions. Think about the direction you turn the doorknob of your front door. You probably visually simulate what your hand would look like, but if you're like most people, you do more than this. You are able to virtually feel what it is like to move your hand in the appropriate way, to grasp the handle with enough force to cause the friction required for it to move with your hand, and rotate your hand at the wrist. Or if you're a skier, you can imagine not only what it looks like to go down a run, but also what it feels like to shift your weight back and forth as your link turns. Now, in all these examples, you're consciously and intentionally conjuring up simulations. That's called mental imagery. The idea of simulation is something that goes much deeper. Simulation is an iceberg. By consciously reflecting, as you have been doing, you can see the tip, the intentional conscious imagery, but many of the same brain processes are engaged, invisibly, unbeknownst to you, beneath the surface during much of your waking and sleeping life. Simulation is the creation of mental experiences of perception and action in the absence of their external manifestation. That is, it's having the experience of seeing without the sights actually being there, or having the experience of performing an action without actually moving. When we're consciously aware of them, these simulations experience feels qualitatively like actual perception. Colors appear as they appear when directly perceived, and actions feel like they feel when we perform them. The theory proposes that embodied simulation makes use of the same parts of the brain that are dedicated to the directly interacting with the world. When we simulate seeing, we use the parts of the brain that allow us to see the world. When we simulate performing actions, the parts of the brain that direct physical action light up. The idea is that simulation creates echoes in our brains of previous experiences, attenuated resonances of brain patterns that were active during previous perceptual and motor experiences. We use our brain to simulate percepts and actions without actually perceiving or acting. Outside the study of language, people use simulation when they perform lots of different tasks, from remembering facts to listening properties of objects to choreographing a dance. These behaviors make use of embodied simulation for good reason. It's easier to remember where we left our keys when we imagine the last place we saw them. It's easier to determine what side of the car the gas tank is on by imagining filling it up. It's easier to create a new series of movements by first imagining performing them ourselves. Using embodied simulation for rehearsal even helps people improve a repetitive task, like shooting free throws and bowling strikes. People are simulating constantly. In this context, the embodied simulation hypothesis doesn't seem like too much of a leap. It hypothesizes that language is like these other cognitive functions in that it, too, depends on embodied simulation. While we listen to and read sentences, we simulate seeing the scenes and performing the actions that are described. We do so using our motor and perceptual systems. And possibly other brain systems, like those dedicated to emotion. For example, consider what you might have simulated when you read the following sentence a little while ago. When hunting on land, the polar bear will often stalk its prey, almost like a cat would, scooting along its belly to get right up close and then pounce, claws first, jaws agape. To understand what this means, according to embodied simulation hypothesis, you actually activate the vision system in your brain to create a virtual visual experience of what a hunting polar bear would look like. You could use your auditory system to virtually hear what it would be like for a polar bear to slide along ice and snow. And you might even use your brain's motor system, which control actions, to simulate what it would feel like to scoot, pounce, extend your arms, and drop your jaw. The idea is that you make meaning by creating experiences for yourself that, if you're successful, reflect the experiences that the speaker, or in this case the writer, intended to describe. Meaning, according to the embodied simulation hypothesis, isn't just abstract mental symbols. It's a creative process in which people construct virtual experiences, embodied situations in their mind's eye. If this is right, the meaning is something totally different from the definitional model we started with. that is mental ease. If meaning is based on experience with the world, the specific actions and precepts an individual has had, then it may vary from individual to individual and from culture to culture. And meaning will also be deeply personal. What a polar bear or dog means to me might be totally different from what it means to you. Moreover, if we use our brain system for perception and action to understand, then the processes of meaning are dynamic and constructive. It's not about activating the right symbol. It's about dynamically constructing the right mental experience of the scene. Furthermore, if we indeed make meaning through simulating sights, sounds, actions, it's a nasty glistening here. If we indeed make meaning through simulating sights, sounds, actions, that would mean that our capacity for meaning is built upon other systems, once evolved more directly for perception and action. And that in turn would mean that our species-specific ability for language is built up from systems that we actually share in large part with other species. Of course, we use these perception and action systems in new ways. We know this because of other animals don't share our facility with simulation. Returning to the polar bear, I actually had some bad news to share. Since the early reports of the nose covering behavior, polar bears have been observed a lot in zoos in the wild. And despite all the hype, it turns out that there is basically no modern evidence of nose covering behavior. Sorry to disappoint you, but there is actually a much deeper lesson here. A polar bear, unlike a human, probably can't simulate what it looks like to its potential next meal. The capacity for open-ended simulation is something much more human than Earthen, not just in language, but pervasively throughout what we do with our minds. You can simulate what you would like, what look like if you covered your nose with your hand, just as easily as you can simulate what you'd look like if you had two heads, or if you had a pogo stick in place of your right leg. If simulation is what makes our capacity for language special, then figuring out how we use it will tell us a lot about what makes us unique as humans, about what kind of animal we are, and how we came to be this way. Flying pigs, the next paragraph. one of the important innovations of the embodied simulation hypothesis, and one way in which it differs from the language of thought hypothesis, is that it claims that meaning is something that you construct in your head, based on your own experiences. If meaning is really generated in your mind, then you should be able to make sense of language about not only things that exist in the real world, like polar bears, but also things that don't actually exist, like, say, flying pigs. So how we understand language about non-existent things can actually tell us a lot about how meaning works. Let's consider the case of the words flying pigs. I'd wager that flying pigs actually means a lot to you, even without thinking too hard about it. Over the years, I asked a lot of people what flying pigs means to them, informally. According to my totally unscientific survey, conducted primarily with a population of individuals with a type on their hands and a beverage in their glass, when most people hear or read the word flying pigs, they think of an animal that looks, for all intent and purposes, like a pig, but has, I can guess here, wings. The writer John Steinbeck imagined such winged pig and named it Pegasus. He even used it as his personal stamp. What do you know about your own personal Pegasus? It probably has two wings that are shaped very much like bird wings. Without having to reflect on it, you also know where they appear on Pegasus' body. They're attached symmetrically to the shoulder blades. And although it has wings like a bird, most people think that Pegasus also displays a number of pig features. It has a snout, not a beak, and it has hooves rather than talons. There are a couple of things to draw from this example. First, flying pigs seems to mean something to everyone. And that's important because there is no such thing as an actual flying pig in the world. In fact, part of the meaning of flying pigs is precisely that flying pigs don't exist. What all of this means, not to be too cute about it, is that the mentalist theory that meaning is about the relation of definitions to real things in the world will only work when pigs fly. Second, if you, like most people, what you did when you understood flying pigs probably felt a lot like mental imagery. You might ask yourself, did you experience visual images of flying pigs in your mind? Were they vivid? Were they repleted with detail? Of course, consciously experiencing visual imagery is just one way to use simulation. You can also simulate without having conscious access to images. But where there is imagined smoke, there might be simulated fire. If you, like most people, when you simulate a flying pig, you probably see the snout and the wings in your mind's eyes. You may see details like color or texture. You might even see the pig in motion through air. The words flying pigs are not unique in evoking consciously accessible visual data. The same is true for lots of language, where the things it describes are impossible, like flying pigs, or totally mundane, like buying figs, or somewhere in between, like the polar bear's nose. Third, and I don't expect that this occurred to you because it only became clear to me through my extensive research. Flying pigs doesn't actually evoke something of the genus Pegasus for everyone. For some people, flying pigs don't use wings to propel themselves, but instead conscript superpowers. If your flying pig is of this variety, let's call it super swine, then probably it wears a cape, maybe a brightly colored spandex unitard too, with some symbol on the chest, like a stylized curly pigtail, or better yet, a slice of fried bacon. And what's more, when it flies, super swine's posture and motion are different from those of wing flying pigs. Whereas wing flying pigs hold their legs beneath their body, tucked up to their bellies or hanging slightly below them, super swine tend to stretch their front legs out in front of themselves, a la Superman. I'll be the first to admit that the respective features of Pegasus and super swine are not of great scientific value or vital public interest in and of themselves. But they do tell us something about how people understand the meanings of words. People simulate in response to language, but their simulations appear to vary substantially. You might be the type of person to automatically envision super swine, or you might have a strong preference for the more common Pegasus. We observe individual variation like this not only for flying pigs, but equally for any bits of language. Your first image of a barking dog might be a big, ferocious Doberman, or it might be a tiny, yappy Chihuahua. When you read torture device, you might think of the Iron Maiden, or you might think of a new Stairmaster at your gym. Variation in the things people think words refer to is important because it means that people use their idiosyncratic mental resources to construct meaning. We all have different experiences, expectations, and interests, so we paint the meaning we create for language we hear in our own idiosyncratic color. And finally, flying pigs teaches us that when you engage your visual system to understand language, you do so creatively and constructively. You can take previously experienced percepts, such as what pigs look like, and actions such as flying, and form new combinations out of them. What flying pigs means depends on merging together independent experiences, because you have probably never experienced anything in the real world that corresponds to flying pigs. Unless you spent a lot of time at Pink Floyd concerts in the 1970s. That makes flying pigs an extreme case. But even when language refers to a corresponding real-world entity, even in mundane cases, you still have to build up a simulation creatively. Consider the totally boring expression, yellow trucker hat. Now surely there exist yellow trucker hats in the world. You have probably seen one. Whether or not you were so moved by the experience as to remember it. But unless you have a specific stored representation of a particular yellow trucker hat, the mental images that you evoke to interpret this string of ordinary words have to be fabricated on the spot. And to do this, you combine your mental representation of trucker hat with the relevant visual effects of the word yellow. When words are combined, whether or not the things they refer to exist in the real world, language users make mental marriages of the corresponding mental representations. And we jump over to the new science of meaning. The next step is to put the idea of embodied simulation under a microscope and really put it to the test. But how? The currency of science is observable, replicable, observations that confirm or disconfirm predictions. But as I noted earlier, meaning doesn't lend itself willingly to this kind of approach because it is quite hard to observe. So what to do? Facing this quandary as you are in pretty much the same place where the field of cognitive science was in about the year 2000. There was this exciting, potentially groundbreaking idea about simulation and meaning. And yet, we had no idea how to test it. And that's when the ground shifted. Right about the same time, a handful of trailblazing scientists started to develop experimental tools to investigate the embodied simulation hypothesis empirically. They flashed pictures in front of people's faces. They made them grab onto exotically shaped handles. They slid them into fMRI scanners, and they used high-speed cameras to track their eyes. Some of these approaches failed completely, but the ones that worked rocketed meaning onto the front page of cognitive science, and they provided us with instruments that now allows us to scrutinize humans in the act of making meaning. The next 10 chapters are a tour through this fascinating new science that is unraveling how meaning works. To make headway toward an answer, we look first at how people use simulation when they are not using language. For instance, when they are merely imagining hypothetical situations or recalling past experiences. By spending some time with bowlers, visualizing how to bowl strikes, and with competitive memory champions, remembering randomized decks of cards, we'll discover how people think about simulating the sights and sounds and actions they're thinking about. We then carry this insight over to language and look at the evidence that people do the same thing for sights, sounds, and actions that they hear or read about. Subsequent chapters explore the details, how people understand language about things that they can't see or hear, like ideas and time, how the grammar of a sentence affects the meaning people extract from it, how meaning differs from culture to culture, and how people with different experiences understand the same words and sentences differently. The product is an account of how people comprehending language avail themselves of various cognitive systems at their disposal to actively create an understanding of the words they hear. In other words, this is the story of how you ever managed to understand anything. It's the story of how you breathe life into your own personal Pegasus, and the story of how you figured out why a polar bear would ever cover its nose. Chapter 2. Keep your mind on the ball. In '91, Barry Bonds played outfield for the Pittsburgh Pirates. He was a quick, dynamic player, but not a physically imposing one. At 185 pounds and 6'1" tall, he had a similar build to that of his father Bobby, also a professional ball player. Then in 1993, Barry moved to San Francisco to play for the Giants, and something happened. He got big. And this was no typical middle-aged ripening of the belly. He added muscle. The slim outfielder became a beefy 228-pound slugger, and it helped his game. From 1991 to 2001, he nearly tripled the number of home runs he hit. And in 2001, he had arguably the best offensive year in the history of the game, destroying the previous home run record with 73. Maybe the California sunshine was good for him, or it could have been something in the food. Or perhaps he discovered that sprouts and avocado had previously unrecognized muscle promoting properties. More likely though, at least according to common wisdom, he discovered anabolic steroids. Taking steroids carries a host of undesirable potential side effects. They can cause acne, enlarged breasts, and shrunken testicles, and they are also illegal. And yet, athletes continue to endanger their bodies and careers by taking them, because steroids work. They allow the athlete to train harder and recover more quickly. And the more you're able to train, the better you probably do. To hit more home runs, practice hitting a ton of pitches. If you want to improve your tennis serve thousands of balls. To be a better bowler, go out and roll. The more practice, the better. So Bonds triply hit the juice, and it worked. But right about the same time, there were a bunch of trainers using a different approach. And I think I mentioned this. This is the event when visualization and cognitive science, because of advantages, come into sports. It's very interesting. It's about the same time. One that I thought would help improve batters hitting and golfers putting, and not cause anything to unduly enlarge or shrink along the way. It started in the 1980s. Certain trainers started wondering whether they could help athletes improve their respective skills using a strategy that didn't involve physical training at all. Their motivation was simple: actual practice has limits. For one, it's costly in that you need a field or a court, equipment, trainers, and so on. What's more, you can injure key body parts, muscles, joints, through overuse. Hence the appeal to steroids. So what would happen, they mused, if you had athletes practice less and spend their time visualizing their performance instead of actually doing it? Would imagining shooting free throws improve your actual free throw percentage? Would visualizing perfect bowling form produce more strikes? So they took some tennis players and had them lay off the serves. They had the bowlers lay down their balls. They directed basketball players to lie around in the locker room, and they had them visualize. At first, they probably met with a whole lot of resistance. After all, how could you actually improve at serves and free throws by doing anything other than practicing more? If you're trying to hit a small green ball over a 3-foot tall net into the corner of the service box 60 feet away, then any reasonable person would practice doing exactly that. But the thing is, all the sitting around worked. The athletes who spent their time visualizing hit more of the serves in, bowled more strikes, and knocked down more free throws. At least, that is, as long as they visualized performing their skill successfully. If they imagined bowling strikes, they were more likely to bowl strikes than if they didn't visualize anything at all. But if they visualized rolling gutter balls, their bowling got worse than if they did nothing. Visualizing is now a standard part of sports psychology. It doesn't replace anabolic steroids. It's not clear, for instance, that Barry Bonds would have reached his peak home run hitting potential without controlled substances. Nevertheless, visualizing works. The question is why? Why is it that imagining using your body in a particular way makes it easier for you to move your body in that same way later? The answer that we'll see in this chapter is remarkably simple. When we visualize actions consciously and intentionally, activating mental images, we use the very parts of the brain that control our body's movement. When we imagine the footwork we employ to serve a tennis ball, the part of our brain that controls foot motion starts firing. When we think about how we hold the basketball in our hands, the part of our brain controlling the hand motion lights up. As a result, whether you call it mental imagery, visualization, or mental rehearsal, imagining doing things is extremely effective as solidifying motor skills. And that's because, to a large extent, when we're visualizing, our brain is doing the same thing it would in actual practice. Admittedly, we're missing some things that might be quite useful, like the feedback and conditioning we gain from actual action. But at the same time, we also avoid the costs and strains on our body. The important thing is that we visualize an action in terms of what our brain is doing is a lot like performing the action. Well, once more, the Klein bottle logic is entering into the action. And the bigger picture that we are going to see in this chapter is that what's true of visualization is also true for a variety of other mental activities. Actively imagining or visualizing an action reuses parts of the brain that actually control those imagined actions. And this is a pervasive property of the mind. We also use our brain's action and perception systems for memory. When we recall events, we reconstruct what they felt like, looked like, or sounded like, and this again uses parts of our brain whose primary duty is to allow us to perceive or participate in events of those types in the first place. And likewise, when we think about properties of objects, to decide whether an object has certain properties, for instance, what color a polar bear's nose is, we use our vision system to construct mental representations of what a polar bear's face look like. All of this is to say that lots of things we can do with our brain, things other than moving our bodies or perceiving the world, make use of parts of the brain primarily responsible for moving our body or perceiving the world. As it turns out, the trainers exploring visualization hit on something that cognitive psychologists have been studying for a long time. At the outset, the psychologists were mostly looking at visual imagery, images in the mind's eye. So that's where we'll start, in a lab at Cornell at the turn of the 20th century. It's called the Perky effect. I'm going to put a small pause in here. In 1910, an innovative young American cognitive psychologist named C.W. Perky was experimenting with a relatively new technology, passing light through film to project images on a blank wall. Of course, this technology would come to revolutionize entertainment in the form of moving pictures. And it turns out that it did the same for the study of the mind. Perky wanted to explore what was going on inside people's heads while they were performing mental imagery, while they were actively, consciously conjuring images of things that weren't in fact in front of them. What she did was to ask participants to imagine seeing an object like a banana or a leaf while they were looking at the blank wall. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to them, she projected an actual image of the object they were supposed to be imagining on the wall. At first, the projected image was below the threshold for the participants to consciously perceive it, but she increased the illumination slowly so that it became more and more visible. Perky found that many participants continued to believe that they were still imagining the banana or the leaf, and failed to recognize that there was an actual real projected image on the wall. And yet she knew that the projection was visible, because when she asked other participants who were not performing imagery to look at the wall, they were able to see the green or yellow image easily. Perky's experiment showed that performing mental imagery can interfere with actually perceiving the world. The so-called Perky effect comes up a lot in daily life. It happens, for example, when you daydream. During daydreaming, you are completely awake and your eyes are open, and yet you are imagining being somewhere else, doing something else, seeing things that aren't there. Maybe you're disappointingly picturing the content of your fridge and wondering how you're going to conjure a respectable dinner out of half a cup of bacon bits and a bottle of bacon ketchup. Or you envision the look on your boss's face when you tell her you won the lottery and you are moving to Hawaii. But while you're doing all this, despite having your eyes open, you aren't processing much of the visual world around you. If you're in a classroom, you don't see what's being written on the board. If you're in a car, you might not see the cars around you or the street signs. Imagery interferes with vision. Natural research on Perky effect didn't stop with this discovery in 1910. More recent studies have started to paint a somewhat more textured picture of how imagery interacts with vision. For one, what you are imagining affects whether it interferes with what you're seeing. If you have someone look at the middle of a computer screen and imagine a T, and then you display either a T or an H in the middle of the same screen, what you find is that they are less likely to correctly detect the displayed letter when it's actually an H than when it is a T. And vice versa if you have them imagine an H. Here's how that might play out in the real life, if it's anything like mine. Suppose you're looking for your brand new phone, which is red, and you're a little distracted, and as a result you're actually holding in mind a mental image of your old phone, which was black. Because you got in mind a mental image of a black phone, it will be relatively hard for you to actually see your new red phone, even if you look right at it. But as soon as you remember that you have a new red phone, your mental image no longer interferes with actually detecting the phone when you in fact come across it. This actually happened to me today. I was looking for a very small bottle, and I imagined it to be brown like most medicine bottles, contained some sort of liquid, a sort of nail treatment medicine. But it came to turn out that the bottle was actually clear, white, clear, transparent, and I failed to see it, even if I had it just in my gaze. It was there, I could not see it. The transparent one eluded my vision. And oddly enough, it was my hand, when not looking, put in the bag where everything is, of toiletry. I found it, and to my surprise, it was not brownly opaque, it was clear. Which is odd, but still, it was the thing I was looking for. So in this put into examples, that is, if you're told to imagine the eye in the upper part of the screen, then you're less likely to accurately detect an asterisk in the upper part of the screen. But when the locations are different, when you imagine an eye in the upper part of the screen and then are shown an asterisk in the lower part of the screen, you detect the asterisk just as well as you do when not performing imagery at all. This line of Perky-inspired research shows that although the visual imagery sometimes interferes with vision of different things in the same location, it also sometimes can actually enhance vision. When the image depicts the same thing you're imagining, and it's in the same place and of compatible shape and size, you are actually better at perceiving the thing in front of you than when you're not performing imagery at all. If you're correctly envisioning your new red phone and you cast your eye over it, you'll see it more quickly than if you had no image of it at all. What to make of the fact that imagery and perception interact? There could be two things going on. The first is that visual imagery and visual perception might be performed by the same parts of the brain, which would cause interference because it's known that we can't use the same brain tissue to do two different things at the same time. This is in itself an intriguing idea, that we use parts of our brain that perform vision to also see in our mind's eye. Alternatively, though, it could be that our capacity for imagery and vision are just performed by two very tightly linked but distinct systems, and that when these systems are working on the same problem, they thrive, but when they aren't in sync, they don't work so well. And although it doesn't matter to us when we can't find our cell phones, why is it that our brains don't let us see them when they are right in front of us? It matters to anyone who wants to know how mental imagery works. Fortunately, there's a second finding that Perky reported in her original study that helps us distinguish between these two possibilities. When Perky asked her experiment participants to describe their mental images of bananas or leaves, they reported imagining objects that conform to the shape and orientation of the images she had been projecting on the screen, which is quite surprising because they had said that they hadn't seen the images themselves. So if she displayed a vertically elongated yellow blur while her subjects were imagining a banana, they reported having imagined a banana that was standing upright. A horizontal yellow blur would produce reports of horizontal bananas. In other words, even though they didn't report actually seeing a projected banana, Perky's participants nevertheless integrated what they were actually seeing projected on the screen with the mental imagery they were constructing. More recent research has shown in an even more lucid way how people integrate what they're imagining with what they're seeing. In one study, people were asked to imagine the New York skyline while looking at the screen. Meanwhile, the experimenters projected a faint red circle on the screen. The projection was faint enough and the Perky effect was strong enough that the participants didn't report seeing the red circle. However, some of them reported that they had constructed a mental image of New York at sunset. Let's move a bit in this direction. Sorry. What these findings show is that the things you see can be confused with and integrated with the visual images you fabricate. The simplest way to understand these facts is that visual imagery and visual perception are subserved by the brain systems that are more than merely linked together. For vision to be confused as imagery, for people to actually think that what they're actually seeing is merely the content of their imagination, there must be at least some overlap in the brain system that people use to perform the two distinct behaviors. Later in this chapter, we'll look at brain imaging studies that will allow us to see exactly how much overlap there is between seeing and imagining, and where in the brain it's located. The mind spins. If the same brain systems are used to imagine and perceive objects at rest, like bananas and leaves, then it's quite possible we could also use the same systems to both imagine and perceive objects when they are in motion. One of the classic studies in cognitive psychology show this in a particular compelling way. Well, we have a drawing of some cubes here. I'll show that later. Look at each of the pairs of objects in figure 2. This is on page 30. Each pair of objects, for example, the two shapes in A, is either the same object rotated differently or two different objects that are mirror images of each other. Your job is to decide as quickly as possible whether they are the same object or mirror image objects. So are the two objects in A the same object, just rotated or mirrored imaged objects? How about B and C? These things are very close to what you find in an IQ test, where you have to rotate geometrical figures looking like Tetris things. It's worthwhile to reflect for just a moment on how you figured it out, what psychologists find in this experiment and others like it, whether using letters or complex shapes, is that the time it takes people to answer that two images are rotated versions of the same object increases linearly with the degree of rotational difference between them. That is, if it takes you 2 seconds to make a decision for the objects that are off by 40 degrees, and 3 seconds for objects that are off by 60 degrees, then it will take you 4 seconds for objects off by 80 degrees, and so on. The best explanation for this finding, and the intuitive answer most participants give when asked how they compare the objects, is that you're imagining rotating one object to see if it lines up with the other one. Mental rotation, as it turns out, works as a constant rate, measured in mental degrees per second. So it makes sense that it takes you progressively longer to respond the farther you have to rotate your mental image of the object. There is an analogy between perceived motions and imagined motion. Suppose you're in a helicopter looking down at an island below you, maybe one that looks like figure 3. You'll see a hut, well, some trees, a lake, grass, a beach, do you imagine? Maybe other landmarks. If you're looking at the hut in the south, say, then want to check out the well. It doesn't take you very long at all to move your eyes there, compared to, say, when shifting your gaze from the hut to the tall grass well to the north. The farther you have to move your eyes, the longer it takes. The relationship between distance and time is linear. Longer motions take proportionally longer than short ones. So now suppose you're not looking at the island, but instead merely inspecting a mental image of the island as you recall it. If your focus is in your mind's eye on one landmark, say the hut again, and then shift your gaze to the well, it takes you less time to get there than it does to get, say, to the tall grass. In fact, the relationship between the distance your eyes travel in your mental image and the time it takes to get there is again linear. Scanning a mental image is functionally like scanning the real world. Klein bottle logic once more. What this all means is that you perceive motion in mental images like you do real motion in the world, because things that take longer in the world also takes longer in the mind. Because it's like real motion, mental motion is useful. Do you remember from 3 lectures ago the fantastic article by Wilson? Here we see the similar. For example, suppose you want to plan a trip across the island, hitting several key points. If you first imagine a couple different paths, then you can get a pretty good estimate of how long each would take, which would just save you time when actually hit the ground. Mental imagery saves your time by letting your mind do the walking, and it needs to be the same time, the same motion. As Wilson showed, if it's not the same time, it wouldn't work in the real world. And in the example of Wilson, it was an outfielder and how he catched a fly ball. And it can only be done with him moving and thinking in the same speed as the ball is moving. Seeing the ball is not pertinent or important. And if he's moving in the same speed, in the same direction, he will catch the ball before it hits the ground. And then they can make a home run. Stimulating sounds. Neuroscientists have known for more than a century that specific brain regions are responsible for particular cognitive functions. The phrenologists of the late 18th century believed that not only were different aspects of the human psyche localized at different points within the brain, but that moreover the shape of a person's skull served as a measure of how developed those different brain regions were, and thus were a measure of the person's psychological disposition. Although the last part has turned out not to be true, you can't judge a brain by its cover. There is truth to the first part. Specific parts of the brain are most adept at performing particular functions. Never was this demonstrated more strikingly than in the work of neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield. Penfield worked with people suffering from severe epilepsy, people whose debilitating seizures endangered their well-being and that of those around them. The treatment he pioneered in the 1930s was as revealing as it was shocking, and I mean both of those things literally. He would first surgically expose the patient brains. He then searched the brain for offending region, the damaged area responsible for the epileptic attacks, by applying a targeted but gentle electrical current to various parts. The catch is that in order for him to be able to determine what function each part of the brain performed, he needed patients to be awake. So during this procedure, they were only under local anesthesia. Penfield would apply the electric stimulation to a given area, like the numb, and would observe the patient's reaction. What he found was that consistently across patients, the same brain regions produced the same sorts of effects. For instance, stimulating the areas to the right of the vertical dotted line caused a patient's body parts to twitch or move. He had found the motor cortex, the area responsible for sending electrical signals to the body's muscles. Stimulating the areas directed to the left caused patients to experience tingling or numbness in different parts of the body. This is the somatosensory cortex, where the brain collects information about the sense of touch from the skin and muscles. But most surprising was perhaps what happened when he applied the electrical current to a specific spot between area 21 and 18. When he asked patient DF what she was experiencing, she reported that she heard music, and not just any music. She heard an orchestra playing a specific piece of music, as clearly, she said, as if she were hearing it on the radio. Every time Penfield removed the electrical stimulation and then reapplied it, she heard the same piece of music starting from the same place at the same tempo. Other patients had similar auditory experiences with stimulation of that same part of the temporal lobe, though not the same song. Penfield had found one of the brain regions dedicated to audition. When we hear actual sounds, the signal passes through this area, and when electrical current is applied to it directly, it recreates the experience of hearing. Fortunately, for people interested in understanding how auditory imagery works, it can also be induced by far less invasive procedures. For instance, one recent study used an ingenious approach. Participants listened to pieces of music, like the Rolling Stones' Satisfaction, or the theme song from the Pink Panther. Meanwhile, the blood flow in the brain was scanned by using an fMRI machine. This enabled the researchers to identify what parts of the brain were at work during listening. But because they were interested not in how people hear, but how they imagine hearing, there was a twist. The experimenters replaced short segments of music, 2 to 5 seconds at a time, with silence. If you've ever driven through a tunnel while listening to the radio, you know that when you're listening to a song, you know, as soon as the music cuts out, you spontaneously hear the music in your mind's ear over the crackling of your radio. The brain activity measurements that the experiments took from this periods of silence showed, as you might expect from Penfield's discovery, activation in the brain areas responsible for audition, including the area that, when stimulated, created an experience of musical imagery in patient DF. The exact parts of the auditory system that were active during the periods of silence depended upon how familiar the music was to the participant and whether it had lyrics. Just as you use different but closely related brain regions to hear different types of sound, so you use different brain regions to imagine sound. In recent years, other studies have replicated the same basic findings with more direct technique. When people are explicitly instructed to imagine specific sounds, auditory brain regions once again light up. The upshot is that we imagine sounds using the same brain regions that allow us to hear sounds. This is the Klein bottle. Shows that muscles and neurons are not different things. They have been developed from a common strand, and it's almost classical physics to think they are completely different. And it will, as we understand from Georgi Buzaki, Wilson, and now Bergen, it will lead to incredible problems for us if we think them to be completely different. That imagining is something absolutely different from action. It will make our imagining dull, not strong enough to be able to perform the things that we want. Pretension and retention will be weakened, whereas quantum mechanics will help us to strengthen those things. So we've seen that brain systems used for vision and hearing are reused during, respectively, imagery of sights and sounds. But let's return now to actions. Consider some actions that you perform regularly. How much do you know about them? For instance, when you write with a pencil, do you use your ring finger to hold it in place? Before you move on, decide on an answer. And here's another question. Which way do you turn the key to open your front door? Again, try to settle on an answer before moving on. If you're like most people, you answer this question in one of two ways. You might fool around with your hands, pretending to hold the pencil until you can actually see and feel the answer. That is, you might enact the actions you're thinking about. But you might have better things to do with your hands, like maybe hold this book or maybe you're lazy and can't be bothered to move, and so instead of engaging the muscles of your hand and arm, you might just imagine holding a pencil or turning a key. In other words, maybe you construct motor images. It's hard to describe what the motor image is like. Most people have a good intuitive feel for visual images. All I have to do is to say flying pigs, and you're off. But motor images are pretty hard to grasp, so to speak, because they don't look like anything. That's why I asked you about the pencil and the key. Some people report that motor imagery feels like a tingling in the muscles, their imaging moving, while others report some psychological discomfort at both trying to move and holding themselves back. Still others report more somatosensory than motor imagery. Somatosensory imagery is an internal recreation of the feeling of your body, like pressure on your skin, or motion or tension of your muscles. But all these different conscious experiences derive from motor imagery. Everything is coming from the combination of motor cortex and muscles and body themselves. In the same way that auditory imagery is performed by brain systems primarily dedicated to hearing, motor imagery uses the parts of the brain that move your body around. Some of the most convincing evidence comes from brain imaging studies. Participants first learn to perform a specific action, such as pressing the four fingers on one hand against the thumb in some order. And then they learn to imagine performing the same action without actually moving their body at all. Then they are slid into the brain imaging device, for instance an fMRI machine, and perform the action itself, then the motor imagery of the action. The experimenters then determine the brain areas that are significantly more active during these actions than some control tasks. What they found is that both performing actions and imagining actions engage the key area responsible for sending signals to the muscles in order to move them, the primary motor cortex. Perhaps not unexpectedly, the activation in this region is often stronger for actual action than imagined action, which is in a way a pale shadow of the real thing. The thing is, the primary motor cortex isn't homogeneous. It's an organized topographically by body parts. In essence, there is a map of your body on the surface of your brain. The catch is that the body is represented disproportionately in the motor cortex. Those areas that you have finer control over have a larger dedicated portion of the motor cortex. As you can see, remember the hand face. That hand, larynx, mouth, tongue takes up much more of the motor cortex than, for instance, your knees. This organization of the motor strip according to body parts turns out to be quite useful for brain imaging studies. If we have people perform motor imagery in a brain scanner, we can tell whether the specific parts of the motor strips that are active are the ones that are dedicated to performing particular actions, using the particular part of the body that the person is imagining. One study had participants first flex their hands, feet, or tongue in the scanner. This allowed the researchers to map out the individual participants' motor strips. Then the participants were asked to just imagine performing these same actions. As in the study described above, the findings show that primary motor cortex was active during both real action and imagined action. But the intriguing new finding was that this motor cortex activation was body part specific. That is, when the participants imagining flexing their feet, the top part of the motor cortex lit up. That is the part that controlled foot actions. But while they were imagining moving their hand or tongue, the middle and lower parts of the motor cortex became active respectively. Now, as you saw when you tried to figure out which way you turn the key to your front door, it is not easy to keep your body from moving when you are imagining acting. Could it be that the results from these two studies are due not to the motor imagery, but to actual, though unintended, movement? Maybe when they were supposed to be merely imagining actions, participants were inadvertently moving their hands, feet, or tongue. To handle this very reasonable objection, another study used feedback to make sure participants weren't moving at all. The experiments first taught participants to make a fist and then to release it repeatedly once per second. Then they trained them to simply imagine performing that action. And then they came up with a very clever way to ensure that while the participants were engaging vivid motor images, they weren't moving their hands at all. They used something called electromyography, basically just a readout of the electrical activity of the muscles. They hooked up some electrodes to the participants' hands and showed them electromyographic readouts of what their hand muscles were doing in real time. So the participants could literally see from the fluctuations of the electromyographic readout whether the fist clenching muscles were moving at all, even slightly, while they were imagining making a fist. Using this feedback, the participants were able to train themselves to create motor images of first clenching without actually engaging their hand muscles at all. Once they were good at this, the experimenters used fMRI to locate what part of the brains the participants were using to actually clench their fists and what parts they were using to imagining clenching their fists. They found 3 key areas of overlap, and importantly, both imagining and enacting the actions engaged the main brain regions that control action. What this shows is that the motor imagery involves the use of the motor cortex, even when people are definitely not moving. Now you might be wondering, if you use the motor neurons in your brain to imagine performing actions, then how is it that you're not in a constant state of full body spasm during the day every time that you imagine physical action? Well, for one thing, the motor activation we observe during motor imagery is never as strong as that during actual action. As a result, it's a weaker signal that gets sent to your muscles, so there's less danger of acting out the actions you merely think about. But in addition, the last study actually made an intriguing finding about one difference between imagery and action. A number of parts of the brain associated with action lit up during both tasks, including the primary motor cortex, which we've been discussing, and others that organize higher level motor controls, like the pre-motor cortex and supplementary motor area. But one difference between acting and imagining actions stand out. That's the cerebellum, the little brain in the lower back of the brain, which was active during action execution, but not action imagery. The difference is important because the cerebellum plays a role in the coordination of movements. One way that motor imagery might differ from motor action is that the absence of activity in the cerebellum might shut off actual action, so that the other motor areas can go about imagining performing actions without the body flailing about. Memory. Because imagery is built upon brain machinery that we use constantly to perceive and act in the world, it has certain reliability, and as it turns out, this makes it extremely useful, not just for straightening out your golf pots. The ancient Greeks discovered an ingenious way to conscript imagery to service. Yet, you see, the ancient Greeks, the philosophers anyway, really liked talking. They told stories that were very, very long. Think Homer. They liked history, debate, philosophy. But the thing is that most of them couldn't read or write. And even those who were literate still didn't necessarily find it to help that much in public speaking. Suppose you wanted to be able to whip out your stirring lecture on why ether is the most ideal of the 5 elements. As an ancient Greek, you didn't have the luxury of carrying around a BlackBerry or iPad that you could load your speech on, and it wasn't particularly convenient to lug around a pile of scrolls for any eventuality. And as a result, the ancient Greeks needed ways to remember lots of stuff without visual aids. One of the most successful memory innovations was something that we now call the method of Loki. Here is how it works with something simpler than a Homeric epic poem or treatise on ancient physics. Suppose you need to remember a random sequence of 10 words, like the following: water, painting, knife, forest, heart, coffee, boat, nose, radio, key. You could try to memorize it by rote, repeating the words over and over until it's automatic. And that might work with some effort. But the method of Loki works differently and much more deeply. You start by imagining an environment that you know really well. For example, your home. Your home has a lot of different places, like the front door, the kitchen, the bedroom, the closet, and so on. And you can probably imagine what it would be like if you were to stand in each of those places. So now imagine following a predictable path through your home. And at each salient location, imagine seeing the next item in the sequence of words there. So imagine seeing a glass of water in the entryway. Then you move to the foyer and see a painting. Then you come to the living room where you see a knife on the table, and so on. If you know the place well enough, if the path you pick is predictable enough that you can reproduce it reliably, and if the associations you make between objects and their locations are vivid enough, you will be able to pretty easily reconstruct the list of words in this very same order you memorized them, just by using imagery to mentally follow the same path. Of course, if you're memorizing something more abstract than a list of words, you'll need to come up with images for each important part. But the method of Loki presents a very clear example of how mental imagery can be profoundly useful for recalling things. So much so that the world's best modern memorizers use variants of this same method to compete at the World Memory Championships, which is the Olympics of remembering useless information. The reason that the method of Loki works so well is that mental imagery is predictable. Visual imagery works much like actual perception, because when you recall objects, locations, events, and so on, you are re-experiencing sights you've seen and actions you've performed. Using the same brain systems that were responsible for seeing those sights and performing those actions in the first place. Embodied simulation. Imagery is useful and enlightening, but at the same time it's quite a specialized cognitive ability. Imagery is intentional. You can make yourself do it if you want. It's conscious, unlike the vast majority of what your brain does. And it's a sort of niche ability, not something you do as frequently as other routine tasks you do with your mind, like thinking about concepts, reasoning, remembering, and so on. So how representative is mental imagery of the way the mind works in general? Sure, people use their visual system when they consciously, intentionally imagine visible things. But what about them when they are just thinking about objects, not intending to perform imagery at all? Sure, people can use imagery to remember long lists of things. But what about when they're just trying to remember where they left their keys? Is there an unconscious, unintentional, pervasive analog to imagery? In a word, yes. Because we've just been talking about memory, let's start there. When you recall things, even when you're not intentionally and consciously performing mental imagery, you reactivate the same brain circuits that you originally used to encode the sights, sounds, smells, and feel of the memories in the first place. We know this from brain imagining studies. For example, an early study using fMRI had people memorizing 20 words, each associated with either a sound or a picture. One person might have had to memorize the word cow along with the sound of a cow, and rooster along with a picture of a rooster, while another participant would memorize the reverse. The next day, the participants were placed in the fMRI scanner and were presented with the words again, but without a picture or sound this time. In the scanner, the participants had to push one of two buttons to indicate, for each word they saw, whether they had previously memorized the sound or picture of that word. The idea was to measure what parts of the brain became active when they recalled the sounds or the pictures. Whether the brain regions active while people were recalling sounds or pictures were the same as the ones responsible for actually hearing or seeing the stimuli in the first place. So to localize these parts of the brain, they then played all the sounds and showed all the pictures to the participants while they were lying in the fMRI machine. Poor sods. The question was whether the people used the same parts of the brain when listening to the sounds and remembering the sounds, whether they used the same parts of the brain when seeing pictures as remembering pictures. The results are striking. There's a figure here, 7, and here you can see a very good correlance between the imagining brains and the imagined things. In each of these images, the back of the brain is at the bottom of the image, On the left you see the brain areas that are active during perception. Active areas during picture perception. You can see that these are predominantly in the back of the brain, in the occipital lobe, which is responsible for vision. The light patches in picture E are the areas active during sound perception. These are mostly on the sides of the brain in the temporal lobe. Now contrast picture on the left, which shows regions acting during actual perception, with those on the right taken during the recall task. You can see that the activated regions on the right are parts of the active brain areas for respective tasks on the left. In other words, recalling pictures uses a portion of the areas that perform actual vision, just as recalling sounds activates parts of the region dedicated to hearing sounds. And this is found in the task in which people are just remembering whether they saw a sound or a picture when they weren't asked to perform mental imagery at all. Just as recalling sights and sounds activate perception-specific brain areas, so recalling actions activates those parts of the brain that are responsible for engaging those same actions. Here's one positron emission tomography or PET study, another form of brain imaging that shows this quite clearly. While in the PET scanner, participants heard descriptions of actions, for instance, make a fist, and had to perform them. Then in a second round, they heard the verbs, in this case make, and had to say the noun fist that had gone with it. The brain imaging data showed a number of areas that was selectively active when people were performing the actions. There's a large region of activation toward the top of the brain. The back of this region, toward the left of the image, is the somatosensory cortex, which detects touch and motion from the body. So you see a very great correlation here, and I come to think many people who have been into the idea of idealism or solipsism, have they heard about this? That proves that thing wrong. And also this very current by Douglas Hofstadter and some more people about that we don't really perceive reality. Here it's a double take. We both perceive reality and imagining at the same time. And I think this is money in the bank. It shows that it is actually both. And I would say, this is my opinion, it shows the impossibility of idealism and solipsism. And it also shows, I would think, the unreality of the ideas of Douglas Hofstadter. The idea that we only have an image of the world and it's not close to the world. Here it's clearly showed it is close to the world, but not in the way that we normally think. And to be quite harsh, I would say that the idealists, the solipsists, and Douglas Hofstadter and all, they are taking the understanding from everyday language of an outer world and either take it at face value or turn it upside down. The things coming from neurology shows the impossibility of either of those ways. It is just impossible. We are both living in an imagined world and in a real world, and they are codependent. And this can be shown from the neuromuscular seen directly. The remarkable thing that these studies show is that recalling facts, like whether a word was paired with a picture or a sound, or what noun went with an action verb, uses brain systems dedicated to perception and action. This is important. I would say it's very important, because it suggests that the reuse of the brain systems for other cognitive functions might not be limited to intentional, conscious, mental imagery. Instead, it might be an organizing principle of how the mind works. This is the idea behind the embodied simulation hypothesis. Many of our mental capacities are attributable to simulation. Conjuring up a mental image is a way of consciously and intentionally access an embodied simulation. They do so in a more covert way. We may not even be aware that we are mentally simulating. This is because, like most of the rest of what the brain does, embodied simulation isn't necessarily intentional, and it isn't necessarily available for conscious introspection. But it can nevertheless be revealed using some of the same tools of scientific experimentation that reveal its role in imagery. So the embodied simulation hypothesis leads to a pretty clear and testable prediction. In cognitive behaviors other than imagery and recall, people should be using their perception and motor systems for simulation